Hey, hello, you're stuck in trouble with Wolf Gorlick. A few minutes riffing on IT and IT security. Today looking at exception processes, right? We want control. That's what security is all about, right? There's a problem, we put in place a control, thou shalt. And ideally, thou shalt covers 100% of things, in theory. Rarely in practice. As a matter of fact, one of the most important takeaways you can have is whenever you're doing any sort of thou shalt, any sort of standardization effort, any sort of sweeping change, you need to look at it as a percentage of the people meeting that change and the people who are not going to meet that change. Not going to meet that change for any number of reasons. And the tip for you is this: to have a good exception process for handling those people who are outside of the normal process. Right? Those who cannot meet and fulfill the thou shalt. So, for example, let me give you an example. Let's say we have a service account process, and let's say the service account has to have a certain limited amount of permissions, and it has to only authenticate with modern protocols, and we've disabled legacy authentication, those sort of things. So, what would you do for a good exception process? One, you'd have a process that people can follow. That process would have things like targeting the owner, doing risk evaluation of it, doing regular reviews. That process would also have consequences for not having an owner, not having regular reviews, and most importantly, the process would have a time-bound limit. Is this for 3 months? Is this an exception for 6 months? In the meantime, are people working on it to resolve whatever issues we have to make sure the exception goes away? You get the idea. So, with that exception process, we got the control, thou shalt, we got the exception that creates this gray area. Now, this gray area should have a degree of friction in it. We talk a lot in security and design, especially on these videos, about the design principles around friction. We want to reduce friction wherever possible in the end users. Less friction, fewer steps to do the work. Ideally, at a minimum, we don't want to increase the complexity of their jobs because we're putting in place controls. On the flip side, though, we want to make sure that controls are raising the complexity, raising the friction for the attacker, raising the number of steps for the attacker, right? So hopefully we can have so many steps that the attacker just quits. The exception process for a control, in this example, service accounts, is kind of the opposite of that. Yes, obviously, the reason why we have the control is to add friction to the attackers. However, the exception process shouldn't necessarily be completely friction-free. It may have certain things like require additional reviews, more frequent reviews. That's more work. Users may not like it. It's a little more friction. It may have things like, this is my favorite, the service account automatically disabling after a certain period of time if it's not reviewed. I like that one, because otherwise you end up with a whole bunch of out-of-sight, out-of-mind accounts. It may have any number of different ways that requires additional attention and time from the end user. Why? We're always talking about reducing friction. The reason for this is this. The exception process is something that should not be the normal process. It should be something that the users are incentivized to get away from. And what better incentive than to reduce the friction and make their lives easier? To do that, that does mean we need to have a little bit more friction when they're following that process. What do you think about this idea of exception processes? What's a good exception process? Miss anything? Comment, social media. Yeah.